it sounds like as that gap opened up between what you initially thought was the case to what it was that you saw was happening, that it made you realize there was a disconnect between a prevailing narrative, which is typically, I think, around some of the things you pointed, which is emergency, crisis. We've heard the head of the UN talk about global boiling instead of global warming. How would you describe this narrative and what the data actually shows? So to put a finer point on that is, you talked a bit there about weather and climate, and I think one of the most frequent things I guess you would hear from people who would oppose some of the things that you present in your data and your charts is, but this is just weather. It's not climate. The weather might be this, but that doesn't mean the climate isn't heating up or whatever. So what is that gap? How would you describe that prevailing narrative, and what does the data show across that weather and climate trajectory that you say you're no longer as concerned about?
Thanks for the question. So what's funny about the United Nations is that people like their Secretary General, like Antonio Guterres, I think that's how you pronounce his name. I probably butchered that, but they will go on and make these public statements, and they will say that we are in the era of global boiling, or there's no time to waste. We have to act now. Stuff like that. They have this strident messaging of doom, and they publish these posts on Twitter or Facebook, and they make these very bold statements as a call to activism. And that's basically what the United Nations just is. They have this agenda. And but if you actually read the scientific reports that are put together by actual scientists, not the summary for policymakers, which is written by a bunch of bureaucrats to summarize things and take things out of context, not the Working Group 2 report or the Working Group 3. Those are the impacts, adaptation policy reports. Those are all written by bureaucrats with a few scientists that they select. But the actual physical science basis, which is put together by scientists, which is the Working Group 1 report. You can go AR5, AR6, the most recent report. You look at the physical science basis reports. They do not echo at all any of these claims that this is really an emergency and we need to act. Okay, they might point out that, okay, it's virtually certain that humans are the primary driver of recent climate change since, say, 1850. But that doesn't tell you whether or not it's a crisis or that it's a problem. It just says that, okay, this is why it's warmer. But if you look at the sections on extreme weather, which is chapters 11 and 12 goes into it as well, there's really been no observable increase in any meteorological extreme. The weather events that make headlines. And we see this narrative anytime that Mother Nature goes boo, it's climate change. We just saw this last week, okay, with the heat wave last week up in the eastern United States. It was where the high pressure ridge, or they call it a heat dome. It's actually called a ridge. It's a warm core high pressure system. That's what we call it in meteorology. Heat dome is this new term that really only dates back to about 2004. And if you do a Google Trends search on it, it just goes exponentially up as you get in the most recent few years. But it's really, they're called ridges. And if you get them kind of like blocked off in the jet stream, you get them some meridional flow. The jet stream gets wavy. It gets blocked off, and you get these quasi-stationary domes of high pressure ridges. They call them heat domes. We saw that last week. It would happen every summer. That always happens. And the media got into a whole frenzy about it. And we saw some daily record high temperatures broken in the Ohio Valley, a few of those. And there were some and a couple in the mid-Atlantic, and a whole lot in New England, a lot of daily records that were more on the low-hanging fruit side of things. Because if you go back and look at the actual temperature data, you will find that the heat waves of early June 1925, 1895, mid-June like 1933, late June 1988, June of 1953, 1944, In 1934, all of those heat waves were far more intense than this most recent one was, and most of them lasted longer, especially in 1988. 1934 was one of the hottest summers on. It was the second hottest summer on record in the United States, the lower 48, apart from 1936, which was the hottest. So these claims have no merit. And you look at the records that were set, no station, not one long-term climate site in New England where the most intense heat relative to average was this past week and weekend, not one climate site broke an all-time record high for the month of June or all-time record period. Vermont might have tied their June record of 101, which was set at North Springfield Lake, which was also set there in 2003, and it was set previously at another location in 1919. And many of the New England's June temperature records, you look at Maine's, Vermont, New Hampshire, pretty sure New York, and Massachusetts, they're all 1919, June 1919, and those records were not eclipsed. So some daily records get broken during heat waves all the time. It just happens. But in order to see whether or not a heat wave is unprecedented, like the media claims, you have to really look at the data and see whether or not any all-time records were broken, or look at the duration of it. And there's nothing really particularly unusual about the heat wave duration. It was unusual in terms of its intensity this early, but it's not unprecedented. But the media gets away with these claims. And anytime the weather goes boo, that it's climate change. It's probably we're going to probably blame rainbows on global warming here in the next couple of years at the rate we're going. It's getting that ridiculous. We see this with anytime there's a wildfire, anytime there's a tornado, anytime there's a hurricane, whatever it is. They even blame cold air outbreaks, Arctic outbreaks during the winter when you get a polar vortex displacement or split, and it sends temperatures to sub-zero Fahrenheit in Chicago. Global warming, like that doesn't make any sense, but people buy into this. And so they always make a point. And the poster child of global warming has always been more heat waves and more frequent and more intense hurricanes. Those are the big things. And what do those things have in common? They are weather extremes. So when you talk about weather extremes, well, you got to look at trends in that. And if you look at the trends in weather extremes, they're not getting worse. And I think we'll get into that later. I don't want to go on a full tangent. But the media talks about these extremes all the time. That's what climate alarmists fixate on. Anytime there's a bad weather event somewhere, it's our fault. So I go on to Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform I'm using at the time, and I tell these people, I pull up the graphs, the statistics directly from NOAA that's readily available. I always cite my sources and link them. And I think that's one thing that people on my side of our argument don't always do, is they're not always great about citing their sources, where they get their charts from. They're not always good about updating data that take like 10 years out of date. So I've always taken the John Christie approach, is look at the data and plot it yourself and update it and cite your sources, because that gets you some credence. So when I post
Chris,
that,
sorry to interrupt, but your source that you just referenced there, NOAA, for the average listener, presumably that's an official organization that does data collection. What does the acronym stand for?
Oh, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Yeah, and they're official government agency, so their data is always always pretty good. But so anytime you bring up the extremes like that, and you say, okay, there's somebody else today, well, heat waves are becoming more frequent in the United States. And then you show them the chart that I built, which uses data from our Global Historical Climatology Network daily database, which is compiled by NOAA. You look at the data, it shows that the average per station number of days per year that have reached 95 degrees or higher has declined. It was 18% lower during the 60-year period, 1961 to 2020, than 1901 to 1960. And it's been declining for more than 100 years. And you say, well, heat extremes are not becoming more common. So you bring that up. The climate activists will turn around and they'll change the subject. They'll say, well, but the averages are increasing. And they like to do that to gaslight you, to try and say, I got you, but the averages are increasing. but the topic was about extremes. We were talking about extremes, not averages. And so the averages, the temperature, if you look at the average, the global temperature, it's warmer now than it was in 1979 when we have good satellite records, because it's a good global picture of the polar orbiting satellites, and they measure the radiation off clouds in the atmosphere. They can use that to calculate global average temperature in different layers, the troposphere, stratosphere, and they can even subdivide the lower troposphere, upper troposphere, lower stratosphere, upper stratosphere. So the average temperatures are increasing, and I think some of that could be due to carbon dioxide. I mean, the theory, global warming theory itself makes sense. The problem is that you can't really prove in a laboratory experiment that carbon dioxide causes warming by reducing the rate of outgoing long-wave radiation. You can't replicate Earth in a lab, and computer models have a bunch of models are just, you can get a model to say whatever you want based on whatever input you put into it. So a model's not evidence of anything. So the theory makes sense that if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it should cause some warming. The question is how much and how much warming is going to result from that. So the question is how much are humans contributing to that warming, and how much warming will there result from that? And those are questions that are largely unanswered. Even the IPCC does not know. If you actually look in the report, they will tell you it's virtually certain humans have caused 100% of the warming. But if you go into the report, chapter 6, you can find that the climate models cannot reproduce the temperature, the observed temperatures in the instrumental record well at all. And in order to get, and they can't do it under natural forcing, so they assume that natural forcing and internal variability do not exist. They assume it sums to zero, even slightly negative, because they say Earth should be cooling, not warming. But the thing is that we don't understand natural variability all that well, because very little research is funded to look into that. Because you get research grants if there's a problem to study. And if climate change is primarily natural, well, there's not really a problem. You can't tax a volcano. You can't tax the oceans. You can't tax the sun. You can't tax clouds and the feedback mechanisms. So they look to study a problem, which is looking for a human cause. And if you're being funded to find that, if you're being funded to find a human cause, then by golly, you're going to find it. So you get paid to shine, if you find what you shine a light on, is what I'm trying to say. And the IPCC, so they just say, well, we don't know how natural variability works, so we're just going to assume it doesn't exist. But if that's the case, then all the warming that occurred between 1900 and 1945, that could not have occurred, because there's not enough CO2 emitted into the atmosphere by fossil fuel combustion at that time to have any really meaningful impact on the radiation balance of the atmosphere. So that had to be natural. All of that warming that occurred in the early 20th century had to be natural. But they assume that natural variability just sums to zero over this entire time. Okay. So then they don't know how much carbon dioxide has contributed to the warming, because they also don't know how much aerosols contribute to a net cooling or a net warming. Because one model that they have shows carbon dioxide actually warmed the Earth, or not carbon dioxide, aerosols warmed the Earth by a net 0.1 degrees Celsius since 1850. All the other models show a net cooling up to a degree Celsius of cooling. But the model estimates vary. So one of the models, which is the Hadley Center's model, they say that, okay, natural variability sums to zero in the climate model. Natural variability doesn't exist. So the observed contribution to global surface temperature change since 1850 is zero. It's not causing any cooling or warming. That doesn't exist. Okay. So then they looked at the model and they showed that the aerosols cooled the Earth by a degree Celsius. But the target range is the Earth has warmed about 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1850, hypothetically. So that they have a target range of 0.9 to 1.2 degrees Celsius, with about a 1 degree Celsius as the model target to produce the results. Okay, so natural variability is zero. Aerosols cool the Earth by a degree Celsius. So how do we get it to come to the target range? Well, let's just say that greenhouse gases warmed the Earth by 2 degrees Celsius. We don't actually know if they did, but it forces the model to agree with the data. It's called model tuning. They basically just play around with numbers arbitrarily until the model comes into agreement with the surface temperature data set. And people will say, well, there's no evidence of that. But there's actually a couple papers out there, and I've cited them, where they say, if we tune the model to agree with the global surface temperature data sets, and then they declare that the model is successful because it agrees. But it only agrees by coincidence. They just change some parameters in order to get the forcings to produce the desired temperature curve to come into agreement. But they don't actually understand why. We don't know how much carbon dioxide has warmed the Earth. IPCC doesn't know. They estimate, and again, the model, different models, it estimates between 1 and plus 2.2 degrees Celsius since 1850. That's a big range. What has carbon dioxide contributed? Plus 2.2 or plus 1 degrees Celsius. That's a big range. That's a huge standard error, which means it doesn't really, the measurements don't mean anything.